Welcome to all of you on our discussion about mystical experiences and what they tell us in terms of our capacity to connect to altered states of consciousness, non-ordinary states of consciousness. So I'm very excited. Yet again, these opportunities have been very important for us as we continue to explore very important topics, be it consciousness, soul-centered psychology, or neurospirituality. Bonnie?
Indeed. Yes. Well, thank you all. I'd really like to add my own welcome to you. And as you notice, this webinar is called Mystical States and Experiences, Awakening to Soul Through Non-Ordinary Realms of Reality. So I think many of you will already have an idea of what those are, but I wanted to start with my own personal experience. In 2006, I was attending a retreat, and I was not very far into my own process of spiritual awakening or even into psychology very much. The retreat that I was attending was, in fact, based on psychology, but it was really only an early foray into the work that I was doing at the time. I was in the corporate world, and I had attended this retreat in the hopes of finding something useful that I could bring back into the corporate world that would kind of infuse it with more of maybe a soulful kind of experience for people. And in this retreat, we were doing a lot of somatic work. And in fact, I was very much in my head at the time, did not have a lot of understanding about how important the somatic aspect of our being is. And like many people who have experienced quite a lot of childhood trauma, I really didn't understand the value of being in my body or being here even on this planet. And I'm sure some of you guys can relate to that. But the thing that occurred to me was, why would I want to be more in my body? In fact, it seemed like a very uncomfortable place to be. And so as we went through that week, I participated in many of these experiences and activities that were provided for us. And toward the end of the week, we had an experience of holotropic breathwork, which is a process that was created by Stan Grof, and he's a Czech-born transpersonal psychologist. And he developed this process of what he called holotropic breathwork, which was really engaging with the breathwork itself, a certain kind of breathing, a rhythmic kind of breathing, as well as evocative music. And then also it involves some forms of body work, which is an important aspect of it as well. And this was my first experience of it. And so I went into the experience with some trepidation, I will admit, but also some excitement because I was really beginning to awaken to some new ways of being in my body, of seeing the world around me just over the course of the week. And in that breathwork session, something happened for me that I could not identify, but it initiated some kind of energetic feeling that I had never experienced before. And this energetic feeling manifested in this sense of the energy coming up through my hands and my feet into my body and then kind of spiraling up through my body and then releasing itself out the top of my head. And I had no words or terminology for it at the time, but of course now I understand that what it was actually an awakening of my own Kundalini energy, which many of you will know is a Hindu idea that we have this energy that sits at the base of our spine. They look at it like a serpent that is coiled at the base of our spine, and that this energy needs to be released in us in order to bring us into this new way of being able to perceive the world and to be in our bodies and to be in the world. That's a pretty reductive way of looking at it, but I'm sure you will have the opportunity to go look up Kundalini energy if you would like to know more. And I encourage you to do that. By the next day, this energy had changed dramatically so that it became much more complex. And it went from a single kind of spiral to a double helix to more of an energy that was kind of running, looping just up into the heavens and then back down into the earth and then through me as the vehicle. And at that time, it initiated an experience for me where suddenly, as I was listening to some evocative music, all of a sudden I had this experience of almost like rising up out of my body and experiencing myself as this kind of fountain of sparkles, of blue and green sparkles. And this was not something that I was prepared for in any way, shape, or form. I really, as I mentioned, did not have any kind of a psychological background. I did have a religious upbringing, but that was certainly not any part of the teachings that I learned. And so when I had this experience, my first thought was, but am I that? Because my experience was of myself as being that energy that was something completely other for me. And it awakened in me just this immense sense of awe and wonder and shock and surprise. And I was experiencing what we know that Jung called the numinous, which is a term that he borrowed from Rudolf Otto, who was a German philosopher who came up with this terminology to describe that sense of something much bigger than us or much different than us that can evoke something like awe or wonder or even dread sometimes. It's not always necessarily a positive, but it is when we are in the face of something much, much bigger. And I will say more about that, but on the heels of that experience, which may have lasted minutes or may have lasted seconds, I'm not even sure at this point because there was definitely a sense of timelessness about it. I also had this then experience of broadening my view and looking at all of us as humans on this planet and just seeing the way that we have almost settled to live in this very narrow realm of existence, and the way that we are so hard on ourselves, and the way that we cause suffering to other human beings and to other beings on this planet and to the planet itself, and to the way that we seemed to be living very, very small lives in the face of what I was experiencing in that moment. And that, of course, sent me into what Stan Grof calls a spiritual emergency, which is when we have some kind of an emergent experience or an expansive experience like that, that we just are not prepared for. We just don't know what to do with it. We don't know how to integrate it. We don't necessarily have the container or the holding or the context for what it is. And so it can definitely be very difficult for us. But of course, for me, what happened was it initiated me into a search for what had happened to me and how I could manage that. When I went back to my everyday life, I did struggle. I mean, maybe many of you can relate to this. You know, when you have something that big happen to you, it's really hard to go back to your own life and just plug right back in and keep on going the way that you were before. So I'm curious, as we now launch and go forward into this, how many of you feel that you have had a mystical experience of some kind, or how many of you have entered what we would call a non-ordinary state of reality? Now, the two are different, and we're going to go into the anatomy of that just a little bit because I think it's important to understand how these fit together, because ultimately it would be really nice to know, at least I think, if there's a way that we can actually initiate these kinds of experiences. And some of you will also be familiar with that as a possibility because indeed you do have the opportunity to meditate or to do some other things that might initiate it. So I see the raise of hands, and that's lovely. Thank you so much. If you'd also like to type into the chat just a yes or a no or answer about what that might have entailed, something like that, please feel free.
Looks like maybe as much as a third of the audience has had an experience.
Wonderful. That does not surprise me at all. And especially among this group, I think maybe many of you like me, when you have these kinds of experiences, it does put us on this path of searching for others who may also know something about what it is that happened to us. And in fact, that is what happened to me. I went back, and because I was having such a hard time integrating back into my everyday life, I immediately started looking for answers. Like I really wanted to understand what this was. I didn't even have the terminology really to call it a mystical experience at the time. I was very, very green in that arena. And so when I went back home and started Googling, the first thing that I decided to look for was Stan Grof, because he is the one that created this experience of holotropic breathwork. And this was the thing that initiated my non-ordinary state of consciousness, which is what leads us to these potential mystical experiences. And so I figured he must know something about it, or maybe he could share something about it if I could find him and engage with him. So when I looked him up, of course, this is no surprise, and synchronicity is always real. I discovered that he was giving a talk at a bookstore, literally 10 minutes away from my home where I was living at the time. And that was within 10 days of me coming back. And so that was such a such a synchronicity, such a surprise. Of course, I went to that talk. I sat on the front row. I think my jaw was on the ground for the entire 2 hours that he was speaking, because he was speaking about all of the things that I had experienced during that non-ordinary state of reality, which is the breath work. And then, of course, during that mystical experience, he was talking about all kinds of archetypal themes that you and I would probably understand, and that really are what make up these experiences that we can have. As we say many times in this work, you really can't make this stuff up. It is real, and it does happen that way. And it did put me on a pretty amazing quest that sent me into many different forays of all kinds of things to understand my own relationship with consciousness. Went into the realms of shamanism and really looked into that deeply. I started doing more holotropic breath work and studied a lot of the different religions and spiritual systems that feed into us, especially the ancient mystical traditions. I went into a lot of Native American or indigenous kinds of understandings and teachings. And all of this brought me deeper and deeper into the work, of course, of Carl Jung. And Jung, as we know, was probably one of the ultimate mystics. He had many, many mystical experiences, which he documented, beginning, of course, in 1913, when he had what he felt was kind of a mental breakdown. And again, we've talked about this many times, but he was really working deeply with Freud and was meant to be the heir apparent to Freud's legacy. Freud was quite a bit older than him. Both of them were really pioneers in this burgeoning field of psychology. And he had had a break with Freud because he just could not agree with all of Freud's understandings. And Freud apparently could not respect some of the new understandings that Jung was bringing in about the collective unconscious. And of course, this work was also based on the work of William James, who was a philosopher, American philosopher, who in 1875 wrote this book called Varieties of Religious Experience. And James was really one of, if not the first person to introduce the idea of the sacred into psychology. But the truth is, the word psyche in Greek means soul. And so there is a connection, obviously, between that word psychology and the study of soul. It means that it is sacred. And of course, we know that in the American Psychological Association, there's over 50 categorizations of different kinds of psychology. And depth psychology is really one of the most sacred or spiritual kinds of psychologies that we would say. And depth psychology is what it was called in the time of Freud and Jung. And that has eventually diverged and, of course, moved into different labels and kinds of psychology. But we know that all of this, as it has evolved, has really brought us into modern day times when a lot of people don't differentiate between religious and spiritual. And so I would just offer that it's a really important tenet that we bring in here, that religion and spirituality are not the same at all. Religion is definitely a more structured kind of spirituality, but as many of these greats have mentioned, the church, and that's the church with a capital C, really became or introduced themselves as the mediator of religious experience. And they insisted that you had to go through a priest, for example, in order to have your own relationship with God or your own relationship with what is spiritual. And so they created this distance between the general population and God, the heavenly beings, the divine. And of course, this is not really one thing that serves us. There's a modern day contemporary Jungian who unfortunately just passed away, Lionel Corbett, who I had the really extreme benefit of knowing and working with in many ways and learning from him. And he always talked about how religion, as we know it today, is secondhand religion, because he suggested that we don't need to be in a classroom or in a Sunday school, for example, reading a book about other people's personal spiritual experiences. We need to be having those personal spiritual experiences ourselves, because it is the only way that we can learn, in fact. So I wanted to maybe just bring this now into something more about the anatomy of spiritual experiences. Of course, we know, by the way, that many cross-cultural indigenous peoples have all kinds of religious and spiritual traditions. Again, I use that word religious when it is more of a structured format. But we know that in shamanic cosmologies, they have ideas of animal guides and ancestral spirits and cosmic beings. Of course, in Aboriginal Dreamtime, they have this same kinds of ideas. It shows up in the Christian mystical visionary realms. It shows up in Sufi mysticism, in Tibetan Buddhism, in the Celtic traditions of the other world, in the Greek mysteries. Many of you will be familiar with the Eleusinian mysteries, which we don't know quite what was happening during those, but thousands of people would come together every 4 years and go into some kind of an event, and they would come out completely transformed, and they were not allowed to talk about what happened in there. But clearly, there was something very powerful going on that was connecting them into these realms of the divine. And of course, we know too that Stan Grof mapped these kinds of transpersonal experiences, spiritual experiences. And he, like Jung, talked a lot about the archetypal perspectives, birth and death and cosmic unity, ancestral memory, and all of these things that really connect us again to what is much larger than the individual. So I just wanted to offer, when the microscope was first invented, it came as a pretty big shockwave to the world, because suddenly, in an instant, we began to realize that there is a world that existed that we could not see with our naked eye, but that includes all of these living beings, these microbes that exist and are living everywhere all the time. And we had no idea that that was the case. And so I just want to offer that the invisible world, as I like to call it, is every bit as real as that world. It's just that we have not necessarily been in touch with the tools that we need to be able to see or to experience that world. Now, those of you who have sought out those kinds of non-ordinary experiences that allow you to get into those states of being that can help you to contact those non-ordinary realms of reality, let's call them. They are realms of reality. They're every bit as real, again, as what we can see and hear. And I'm sure Christophe will talk a little bit about the material science that is in the way and many times of that experience of the spiritual. But I just want to also add, before we go into the anatomy, something about why these mystical experiences matter. It's probably obvious to you if you're listening to this right now, but I will just list out some of these because I think that it's important to kind of bring that in for our framework here. So one thing that mystical experiences can bring to us is psychological healing. So that allows us to surface and to release the unconscious patterns that are at work in our lives all the time. And of course, we all know that we are who we are, quote unquote, because of the experiences that we have had and the lenses through which we see the world, most of which were really put on us in our childhood, or that we took on in order to be able to survive, in order to feel safe and to be seen in our lives as little kids so that we could continue our lives. And therefore, we had to develop these patterns in order to deal with the world around us. So that's a huge piece of it. These kinds of experiences can be extremely healing for us when we are able to go into them and experience them. Expanded consciousness is another one. And so, of course, that kind of consciousness can give us access to the archetypal and the transpersonal realms. This is our kind of microscope. It allows us to be able to see what we did not see before, and then therefore to be able to more understand our place in the world. And so that's the third one, purpose and direction. It gives us contact with guidance from our soul. Well, what I like to call our soul, what Carl Jung called our soul, and that is the idea that our soul perhaps has a blueprint for us, that our consciousness existed before we came here into this world, and that it will continue to exist after we die. And that in the space of this, that perhaps we had a plan for ourselves to come here and to work on certain things in order to be able to have the experiences that we determined that we would need to grow and to expand in the ways that we wanted to before we actually showed up here. So I think this is really one of the most powerful ideas that we can possibly contemplate. And it allows us to then find our purpose and our direction in life. If we can really, truly begin to listen to our soul and to understand that blueprint that our soul has created for us, it will reveal to us what our gifts are, the reason that we are here, what we are being called to do in this lifetime, and what can give our lives purpose and meaning. These kinds of experiences also give us the connection to creativity and to vision. So this allows us to unlock our intuitive insight and to truly be able to see what we could not see before. It contributes to our loss of fear. So many of us go through this world in a very fearful state, particularly, I would say, today in contemporary times with what's going on in the world right now. You don't have to look very far to see something that might create a tremendous amount of fear in you, even if it's, in your backyard when you start to notice the effects of climate change or how the seasons are changing or how there's this mismatch on timing and the baby birds are being born before the food is ready for them seasonally. There's all kinds of things that are showing up for us that are showing us, in addition to things like wildfires and flooding and all of these crises that we are experiencing currently through nature and that are probably going to get much worse. And then, of course, there's all the social disparity and many, many other things that you can probably name much more than I that are creating and contributing to this sense of fear that we might experience in the world. And then, of course, the greatest fear we all have, and that is the fear of death, the fear of ending everything and perhaps losing what our ego understands and knows and holds valuable. And these kinds of experiences can give us peace about death. It can give us that understanding, a felt sense of understanding that we do continue, that we are truly these eternal beings that can never die, that have the understanding that we don't have to cave into these fears about impermanence. And then the last one is the connection that we can sense and feel from these kinds of experiences. And those, of course, give us this restoration of empathy and of belonging and ultimately, of course, of love. And that is what connects all of us. So I want to just then determine a little bit what the connection is between these three things. One is mystical experiences. One is non-ordinary states of consciousness, and one is the numinous. I'd like to begin with non-ordinary states of consciousness and just talk a little bit about what those are from a psychological perspective. We would say that non-ordinary states of consciousness, you might also call them altered states of consciousness. Stan Grof preferred the term non-ordinary because what is ordinary? Well, it's what our ego sees and feels and believes, but non-ordinary can really encompass pretty much anything else. And so these non-ordinary states are states where our perception, awareness, cognition, or our identity can actually deviate really significantly from what we would call the normal waking state. And so these kinds of experiences can be spontaneous, a bit like the one that I had. It was not something that I was trying for or intending to have. I didn't realize or understand that it was going to happen. They can also be intentional. As I've mentioned, we can get to them through certain ways and methods and modalities, and we'll talk about those later in the webinar. And however, they can also be very disorienting, as mine was. They can also be blissful, however. Some people don't ever kind of fall off that bottom edge. If you're prepared when you enter a non-ordinary state of consciousness, if you have the framework, if you have a mentor, if you have the holding, if you have a community, then it's probably more likely that your experience is going to be blissful. But we can enter non-ordinary states of consciousness in many different ways. And of course, we also know that these states can be healing, they can be creative, or they can be destabilizing, again, much as that one that I had was. And so some of the examples of non-ordinary states of consciousness can be deep meditation, prayer, lucid dreams, or also in that kind of hypnagogic state when we are just about to fall asleep, we kind of enter this other non-ordinary state. They can come through near-death experiences. They can come through breath work, of course, as was the case with me. They can come through trauma-induced dissociation. So anybody who has experienced a lot of trauma or a big trauma, whether your trauma was developmental over the course of time, or whether it has been an acute trauma, such as an accident or the loss of a loved one or a death or something like that, this can put us into a different state of awareness. It can dissociate us, but then we don't have access to our everyday ego self. And that opens us up in many ways to having these different kinds of experiences. And of course, a non-ordinary state of consciousness might also be shamanic trance or a vision state. And usually the qualities of these kinds of experiences, non-ordinary states, can be marked by altered time. So a sense of timelessness or time passing doesn't fit the way that it normally would for you. Altered sense of space. You may not recognize or understand where you are or how you got to be where you are, or you might feel you're in a different place than you are. You might time travel or space travel and suddenly find yourself in ancient Egypt, for example. Some of these shifts can cause shifts in our ego identity or our sense of self. Often this is the case. Again, that's why they're called non-ordinary, I guess. Heightened emotions or energy, symbolic and archetypal imagery. So again, this is something that Jung knew very, very well and talked a lot about. In fact, when he was having this break with Freud, he went deeply into this experience of archetypal imagery, and he began having conversations with the characters that he was seeing in his dreams. And this is where his whole concept of active imagination came from, where he could actually engage with these non-ordinary states and characters and objects and symbols from these non-ordinary states and get the information from the psyche, from the unconscious that had something for him to understand so that he could do his own work and have his own personal growth and transformation. And so these states can also include contact with other realms, quote unquote, or other intelligences. And those can show up in any kind of an archetypal form. So that would also include many of what we would consider the transpersonal realm. So these can be divine beings or extraterrestrial beings or angels or figures from ancient past or ancestors. And so non-ordinary states of consciousness are essentially the state from which then a mystical experience can arrive. So first you have to have the non-ordinary state of experience, and then during that, you may, in fact, have a mystical experience. So a mystical experience is defined as a specific category of non-ordinary states of consciousness. And mystical experiences are really considered the most profound, the most sacred, as you can imagine, and the most transformational. And so the traits of a mystical experience are the dissolution, often, of the self and other boundary, which results in a sense of us merging with something bigger than ourselves. So that means often mystical experiences will create a sense of union or oneness with the divine, with the cosmos, or with all beings on the planet, for example. These mystical experiences can create a sense of deep, deep peace or ego dissolution. Some people call it ego death, but I really like the idea of ego dissolution. We need our egos to navigate our lives. We cannot just kill it off and be done with it. So that the idea that we can allow it to dissolve while we see something else and be transformed, and then let it come back and be into service of that larger experience that we have had, then it suddenly becomes something completely different, and the ego becomes our ally instead of the thing that is desperately trying to protect us or to help us or to defend, and actually ends up shutting us down or making us stuck at times. Other traits of mystical experiences, we can have a sense of ineffable revelation. So ineffable, you will know that that means it's something that simply cannot really be spoken, often because we don't have the words to describe it. And I can definitely say, and you might be able to relate if you've had your own mystical experience, I couldn't talk about that for years. And it wasn't, part of it was because I just didn't know how to share it, but also because I did not have the words literally when I had the opportunity to share it with somebody that I trusted. And so usually this is the case. When we experience something so much bigger, how can language possibly capture that and define what that experience was? It really cannot. And so when we have these kinds of ineffable revelations, often they come through the felt sense. It means that we have an experience of something that is a deep, deep knowing of it, and yet It was not something that came to us in words, nor that we can express in words. Other traits are that these mystical experiences usually have a sacred or a numinous quality. So we're going to talk about numinous in just a moment. But essentially, it means that there is an atmosphere of awe, of reverence, perhaps of divine presence or wonder, as we mentioned. And the emotional tone around these experiences is usually one of joy and love and surrender and ecstasy. Another thing that we might mention here, I think that is really important, is that mystical experiences usually are based on passive reception, meaning that you have the sense that the experience is happening to you rather than being willed. So ultimately, non-ordinary states of consciousness are something that you can move into intentionally, but having a mystical experience is not something that you can just make happen. It usually comes to you. And I think it's really important that if you have been seeking a mystical experience, if this is something that you're longing for, if this is something that you've learned about from other people and that you would really like to encounter for yourself, and you have not had that experience yet, it's really important, I think, to be gentle with yourself and to really trust, because again, coming back to that idea that we created our own blueprint as consciousness, as the soul self that we are, then we have put a timeline for ourselves that is absolutely perfect for us. And it means that whatever needs to happen before you end up having that mystical experience is going to be critical in your own process of personal growth and understanding. So while I was not prepared for what happened to me at all, and I was not actively seeking it, I really truly believe that I was so head-centered before and so not open and so not seeking these kinds of experiences because I didn't really even know anything about them, that it was the only way that could put me on my own quest to bring me into the person that I am today, with the understandings and the consciousness and the will that I have today to bring this work into the world. For me, that kind of experience had to be the catalyst to put me on this path. If you're already on this path and seeking that mystical experience, then it seems to me you are probably going to have it, because why would your soul self give you that longing to have such an experience if you are not going to have it? Of course, you've already arrange that for yourself. So I hope that you can keep that in mind if you're struggling. I do have a private practice and I work with people who tell me that all the time, why can't I have it? Why can't I have it? And the truth is they will. It's just that they're not there yet because there are other things that they need to learn and to understand before they can get there. Other things that can help them to grow into the kind of person that can hold that experience when they do have it. As I said, I could not hold it because I did not have the structure in my life to be able to hold it. And it was a very, very hard time for me after I came back from that retreat for many, many years, actually. And so I just want to really encourage you to just hold that and continue to seek those non-ordinary states of consciousness. And then I'd just like to close on this section here by talking about what this leaves you with. Mystical experience can often leave you changed with your worldview, your values, and your priorities. Absolutely check for me. Check, check, check. That was very true for me. It can leave you with a sense of purpose or calling, as I mentioned. I didn't know at the time what my purpose and calling was, but it absolutely put me on that quest to begin to understand it and move in that direction. And when I got that sense of calling, it was like a lightning from the blue. I had it suddenly because I had been on that path and seeking to understand what had happened to me for years and years and years and years. It took a long time, but when I got it, I got it. So if you're somebody who has been seeking for meaning in life or trying to understand why you are here, you are on the right path, I can just say. And so then also a mystical experience will often leave you feeling like you've touched something that is eternal, something that is ultimate, something that is bigger than you. And it will also usually give you that sense of you are a soul. You are a soul self. You are not merely a human being having a spiritual experience on this planet. Of course, you are that ultimate spiritual being who is here to have a human experience because there is a reason that you wanted to. So the numinous, just to say, because we've used it a few times now, and I maybe should have started with it, but this was a term that was coined by that German philosopher Rudolf Otto. And then Carl Jung read his book on that topic and adopted it for himself because he felt that it was a very powerful term and very useful. And so the numinous refers to something that is powerful and sacred, usually a presence that evokes awe or dread or fascination. And it often can include also a sense of being overwhelmed by a reality that is wholly other. And that is other with a capital O, because it is something that when we encounter it, we have never encountered before in this way, and that we come face to face with, that is really shocking to our system because our little human experience just has not had that experience before. But it also can feel deeply intimate when you have this kind of an experience, this numinous. And many of you will recognize numinous when you stand and watch a sunset, for example, or you witness a newborn baby, or perhaps you have a dream and you wake up and it's really at its core, it's a sense of the sacred. And so that brings us back to this understanding that depth psychology, what Jung was working on for the longest time, is truly a psychology of the sacred. And so just to give you then kind of the nutshell of what we have been talking about, mystical experiences require a non-ordinary state of consciousness in order to get there. Now, however short or however prolonged that might be, a mystical experience requires a departure from our ordinary analytical awareness. A non-ordinary state of consciousness is the gateway then. So this is what leads us to the mystical experience. And a non-ordinary state of consciousness can be induced by, and this is where we've been going, by dreams, perhaps. It can put you in a state of non-ordinary consciousness that then will lead you to that capacity to have a mystical experience. It can be induced by meditation. It can be induced by psychedelics, by an experience in nature, by trauma, as we've mentioned, and in fact, by divine grace, which I would offer that all mystical experiences are offered by divine grace. And that divine grace is truly related to your own soul, which is divine in all ways. And so we can say that the non-ordinary state of consciousness is the terrain. It's kind of where we're navigating. And then the mystical experience is sort of the peak in that terrain. It's the experience that happens in that terrain that we can have. And those mystical experiences are then often numinous in quality. So they have that felt sense of mystical experience, and it's charged with the numinous. And we can feel seen or held or infused with or penetrated by a sacred presence. And that numinous can manifest as a voice. It could be a vision. It could be a light. It can be a divine presence. And it can be a felt experience of cosmic love or sacred awe. So I think with that, I will turn the time over to you, Christophe. I'm sure you have a lot to say about what happens for us when we have experienced either non-ordinary states of consciousness or when we have these kinds of mystical experiences.
Thank you. It's quite interesting that as Bonnie is sharing as much knowledge and personal experience as she's had with these non-ordinary states of consciousness, I have, for the most part, denied their existence for decades. Like most materialist scientists, we are trained to never recognize states that do not have a physical form, that do not have metrics that we can attach to. And so in my training as a neuroscientist, I began to drink the Kool-Aid of most scientists, which is to never see rationale, evidence behind any one of those states. And it's only in the early portion of my 50s that I realized, sadly, that I had missed that train, that I had missed the opportunity not just to recognize, which in my case, I had probably never experienced a state that I would consider mystical. And since I never accepted the idea that they could exist, I probably missed them altogether. But in my early 50s, mostly because of the urgency of addressing some pretty toxic patterns of depression and addiction, I began to realize that I had no loss at the idea of opening my mind, which happens to be the topic of my last book, which is a process that unpacked quite rapidly over a decade, in which I not only decided to suspend my ongoing denial, but open myself to ways to induce mystical experiences through breathwork initially and the work of Groff. I was also very much seduced by the fact that Stan was a psychiatrist. Therefore, most of his books and his lectures were deeply anchored in a very solid description of the science that we have to understand certain states. And therefore, I was given, if you will, the first rods of the ladder to climb gradually into a much more proactive process of inquiry, process of experiences. And all that was described by Barney was, in effect, what I gradually was able to experience. And I could put more and more science into these phenomena because, fortunately, in the last decade or so, more scientists have done part of this work that I'm describing and, in a way, give up this attachment, you could say this addiction to materialistic science, to become more non-materialist in the way they approach what cannot be necessarily explained. And one of the most important, say, contributor, other than Groff, in converting me, I don't really like the word, but it seems fitting, is a neuroscientist by the name of Mario Beauregard. Now, I'm saying it the French way because he happens to be Quebecois and I'm French. But I highly recommend, if you do not know of the work of Mario, his seminal book called The Spiritual Brain, in which he is not only sharing his own mystical experience at the age of 11 years old, but bringing a very sharp and a very rigorous description of what happens when we experience these non-ordinary states of consciousness. He is at the forefront of research on near-death experiences, among other things, as well as really understanding what we call either spiritual states or religious states of all. And that became really, really pivotal in my understanding of what we know, which is very little, about what neuroscience can explain. Another author, which I highly recommend for his very, very bold work using functional MRI. These are these large scanners. I don't know if some of you have had the stress of being in one of them, that can image the brain when we metabolize the energy that we need to fire our neurons. And bear in mind that as neuroscientists, we have great technology, but technology that is in effect limited to the neurobiology that we can describe and understand about the functioning of our brain. And that is, those cells we call neurons are supposed to explain everything that happens in our brain, from thinking, dreaming, making decisions, but also our movement and the way our body is able to navigate the world. So using functional MRI, Andrew Newberg, who wrote a number of books about the decoding of the way we form belief, the way we enter in states like prayer and others, he put nuns and monks into functional MRI and asked them, which is kind of peculiar considering how stressful these environments are, asked them to pray or meditate, and began to see and observe that certain areas in the brain were not necessarily lighting up, but turning off. And what's been really fascinating to me, and I discuss this in my book, Open, is that what we see happens to states that move us beyond regular states of consciousness. has more to do with networks that seem to be shutting off rather than networks that seems to be lighting up. I guess what I'm saying, and I hope this is clear, we can observe and document the fact that, for instance, rational networks, one in particular you may have heard of called the default mode network, which is, as the term network would suggest, a collection of different areas in the brain that participate in keeping, for the most part, our ego active. We need our ego to do self-referential processing. What does that mean? Well, to know we exist, that we have identity, that we have a certain presence in the world, in a reality that, of course, our ego must control and understand as much as it can. And what's really interesting is under these functional MRI, particularly Andrew was able to notice that these networks are suspended. And in fact, as Bonnie said, she likes or prefers the word ego dissolution rather than ego death. I actually prefer ego suspension. And the reason I do is because I know that as a neuroscientist, we can measure that. I know that we can indeed prove that our mystical experiences or experiences that are induced to be tapping into other realities seems to be more a function of quieting down or pausing certain parts of our brain, particularly those parts that are designed to rationalize, to make sense or provide reason to our experiences. So I find this both curious and actually very interesting. And that is the first door, I think, as neuroscientists that we begin to see, and that is so much of these experiences that we cannot explain or verbalize, i.e. the term ineffable, are indeed created by an underactivity of certain areas in the brain rather than an overactivity. Now, having said that, neurobiology and neurochemistry in the brain is fascinating, and I'm sure you have heard of certain chemicals that we produce in our brain called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are beautiful, amazing molecules that have tremendous role in many of our mystical experiences, particularly serotonin, which is known in the world of psychiatry as a mood regulator, but also is largely implicated in suspending the default mode network and enabling these experiences of awe, of wonder, i.e. mystical for many of them, to be amplified. And so back to my journey, what started for me is this inquiry into well-known protocols, some of them being of indigenous origin, some of them being more contemporary. And if you are interested in what's going on with the incredible potential of psychedelic assisted therapy, I'm sure you've heard that that form of therapy is often using plant medicine that has in some communities been used for thousands of years, for instance, ayahuasca. And ayahuasca in Peru, where I've done some work, is not only well accepted, it's protected by the Constitution. Because in those communities, it has been used for healing purpose, for accessing on demand, you could say, these mystical spiritual states. So my interest was very much in these indigenous practices, which are now well documented by science to be, for the most part, and I say that because there are pathologies and certain conditions that people have that frankly make those particular chemicals not necessarily safe, but to the extent that they can be used very carefully, very rigorously, they are. And so is the work that we now can see happening in multiple cultures around the world around the use of psilocybin, and even MDMA and others. So this is not really a workshop or a webinar on this particular topic, but the reason I mention it is because we now have, I think, good, solid frameworks to help people who are ready to do this safely and with guidance, often medical guidance, to experience these states so that they don't necessarily have to wait for them to happen. And maybe this is controversial. Maybe Bonnie is going to say, how dare you to suggest that people can't, manifest their own spiritual states. In my book, I identify, as a matter of fact, 26 spiritual rituals that do have the capacity to unpack often what we consider more non-ordinary state of consciousness. And it goes from breath work, which doesn't involve the absorption of any kind of substance you don't want to put in your system, to meditation, to stargazing, or forest bathing. There are many books, many traditions that have identified these spiritual systems. I wanted to create an inventory in the book and discuss the spiritual basis, the sometimes indigenous origin of many of those rituals, as well as the state of science, particularly neuroscience and neurobiology, to start decoding what we can, which is limited, to the tools and to the theoretical frameworks that we have today. So in my particular case, to go back to this personal story, it has been since I opened as a scientist and carefully and rigorously began to induce, you can say, many of those states, totally life transforming. It's healed essentially the biggest challenges that I had all my life, accessing peace, serenity, and flow, which is why I'm so committed, as Bonnie is, in bringing education, in bringing awareness, in writing. I mean, let's face it, you don't write books to make money, particularly now. You write books because you typically are your first author and reader, because it's cathartic. But it also may be, in the case of these really profound topics, an opportunity to share, as we are here today. So this is the teaching that I wanted to share, at least for you today, to see that the topic is taking, I think, a very exciting direction. We haven't talked about AI today. We did in prior work on our discussion of the relationship between soul and AI. But AI and the use of AI can also add to our understanding of the brain, aspects of the processing of information that people are willing or can about their mystical experience that can be, to some extent, augmented to some extent with really good theoretical framework. What we can describe are the conditions upon which these states really provide more healing and more soul in our life. That's about it. I think it's probably enough from that perspective, as intense as it may be. So I'll let Bonnie maybe conclude on our lecture and possibly start the dialogue about what you guys have to say. Bonnie?
Wonderful, Christophe. Thank you so much for sharing your own personal experiences. It's also so helpful to see and understand what's happening in the brain. You know, Carl Jung did have his own share of mystical experiences, including a near-death experience that he had in 1944 when he had a heart attack. Now, he didn't actually pass away until 1961. And so this really colored the rest of his life for those almost 2 decades from the time that he had the near-death experience until he did really die. And what happened for him was he felt himself rising up out of his body. Like many of these mystical experiences have a very similar kind of format. So you can see that they are actually archetypal in some way. And he felt himself actually rising right up above the earth and looking down on the earth, and he could see India and he could see the Himalayas. and he could see this large black stone temple with a Hindu or a guru who was sitting outside, a yogi, I guess I should say, sitting outside. And he could sense that there was some kind of a very sacred rite that was taking place inside that temple. He also felt that if he were to enter that temple in his experience, that he would not come back. And so he did hold back from entering that. But he had this extremely expansive sense of understanding that he was so much than his body. Now, ultimately, the doctors were able to revive him and he did come back, but he always described that experience as coming back. It was like trying to fit himself back into his body into a matchbook, because it was the sense of expansiveness that he had coming back into the physical body was just something that he really had a hard time with. And he actually said that it was also very hard for him to integrate that experience. He never really was able to want to come back in the same way that he had wanted to be on this planet before. So we can see that, no matter how these experiences arrive, that they are profoundly life-changing. And if you are interested and willing to do the work to seek out these non-ordinary states that might eventually lead to the mystical experiences, you are definitely going to grow and transform. There's just no doubt about it. And so my recommendation, I think, if anything, would be to identify what some of those processes are. What are those gateways that can actually create those non-ordinary states of consciousness? So I know, Christophe, you have listed a lot of those in your book. I also have a list of about 28 of those, which I'm not going to go through and read right now because I think that a lot of them will come up in our conversation. I'm really interested and will be fascinated to hear from some of you, if you're willing to share, about the ways that you do practice entering those non-ordinary states. Some of you have been willing to share in the chat, which is really wonderful and profound. I've read each of those, and I'm just really grateful for those of you who are willing to share. I think it is important that we talk about these experiences where we can and when we can. And yes, they're not always welcomed or appreciated by the outside world. And so it is important that we talk about them with people that we know can appreciate them, because sometimes they can be not treated as the sacred experiences that they actually are. But here, we would just love to have you share if you're willing. Thank you so much, Darrell. Let's start with you.
Thank you. So happy to be here. I could say ditto to most of what you shared earlier about my experiences. I'm 76 years old and I've been practicing for a very long time, and I didn't set out to do it. But I had an experience recently that is still a sort of a wonder in my mind, because, and it leads to a question that I have, which is the importance of a community like this. And that is, like they say in the Bible, people that speak in tongues then have an interpreter, because they don't always know what they're saying when you're speaking in tongues. And so the interpreter is important. And that's what I want to say, is the community is important in helping interpret what's going on, because sometimes it's so, and it's not unusual for me to have experiences, but sometimes I'm just overwhelmed and don't know how to really, I can integrate it, but I can't understand it. So let me get to the experience. So I'm a shamanic practitioner, and I get to non-ordinary states through drumming easily now. And I have a large property, and I was out on my ATV with my German Shepherd, and I took my drum to a certain part of the property where I have a lot of Native American ruins, because it's a special place for me. And so I was seeking advice, seeking guidance, and I started drumming. I drummed for, I don't know how long, probably 3 to 5 minutes. And my dog, my German Shepherd, was outside of the side-by-side standing next to it. And when I opened my eyes, there was a black-tailed rattlesnake right on the other side of her. And just when I opened my eyes, it coiled up as if to strike, but it didn't. And my dog, whose name is Karma, she comes on command. So when I said, come, she jumped in the side-by-side. And the snake remained coiled for a moment. But when she jumped in my side-by-side, my drum slipped off onto the ground, and the snake very gently crawled right over my drum and went on its way. And as I tell this story, I cannot describe the feeling that I had when this happened. It was as if this reality just opened up, and it was overwhelming. But I still can't come to a meaning for it. And it's been with me ever since, which has been about 2 weeks now. Anyone that would like to share or have any ideas as I share this story about, part of what I want to say is, even though we can get in these non-ordinary states of reality, and as you were talking about Carl Jung, he sees things or you experience things, but when these kinds of things happen and this reality is involved too, for example, if people who see UFOs and nobody believes them, it's a little bit different situation for me anyway, when both realities are merged. Anyone want to speak to that?
I'll just say, when I heard you tell that story just now, I had goosebumps all over, and it happened more than once during the telling of that story. And for me, having those goosebumps literally made me aware that I was already in a non-ordinary state just by listening to your experience of that. So I would just say, in my training, I had many discussions in groups about the value of interpreting dreams or experiences, of understanding symbols, of trying to get to the archetypal, whatever is beneath them. But what we know that Jung said is that we can't really ever understand archetypes. We can see examples of them at work in our lives, but we can't really understand them. And what came out of those discussions many times was that sometimes we just have to let the mystery be the mystery with a capital M. Just your telling of that story has affected me profoundly, and I would bet that it affected some other people here profoundly. So I know that's probably not what you're looking for, because there's a lot of juice for us in really determining what those symbols mean or what those kinds of experiences might be pointing to. But I wonder if one thing you could hold is just that it was simply the experience itself, and what that has done to you or for you is actually the meaning that is there in that experience. Now, yes, I'm sure you can unpack that for probably the rest of your life, because it is a big one. But also I think maybe just a suggestion to be sure and also hold the fact that sometimes maybe we don't want to interpret or analyze the mystery too deeply, because it is that. It is just that. I'm open if anybody else would like to say something or speak to that.
Maybe we can take other experiences in the meantime. Mary?
Hi, that was an excellent information from Bonnie and Christophe. Thank you very much. I have had 3 non-ordinary experiences, and they've all been spontaneous, and they happened in 1998 when I had the first at work, and then again in 2016, and then just a few weeks ago. And the first one, I was at work, and I was handcuffed and taken to the local hospital and diagnosed with bipolar disorder and got into the mental health system. And so I was drugged and wanted to be compliant because I had 2 small children and I had never heard of these experiences. And then it happened again in 2016, and I was again hospitalized for 9 days. But when I got home, it was so different. I had 5 weeks to recover, and I knew intuitively that something was spiritual about that experience. And so I started investigating what that experience was to me. So I learned about shamanism and mental health around the world. And so I knew that was a spiritual experience to me. And the last time this happened was a few weeks ago, like I said. And I was lucky enough to have friends and family around me when it happened. And so they sat with me for 2 days before they got scared and took me to the hospital. But they recorded what I was saying when I was in trance. And they noticed when I was releasing emotionally and they noticed word patterns. And I immediately snapped out of it when they did take me to the hospital. So my challenge, my question, I guess, is how do I integrate this? Like, if it happens again, how do I get people to sit with me and not take me into the mental health system, and to get them to say, this is her bipolar disorder, she's not being rational? How do I get people to hold my hand and work me through it? And in order to help me just, work through what I know I'm naturally supposed to work through.
Excellent questions. Well, I've done personally a lot of research and work on states of psychosis and what they actually mean as far as spiritual experiences go. And there was a lot of work done in San Francisco in the 1960s by, I think it was Weir Perry. Anyway, he had this whole idea to create a place, it wasn't an institution, but a place where people who were having these kinds of psychotic breaks or experiences, breaks with reality, could come and literally be surrounded by people who understood that this was a kind of spiritual emergency that was happening to them, that they were actually getting connected with that something bigger, a realm of reality beyond what most of us normally see as the ordinary, and could sit with them and could hold them and could support them through that. We also know that in shamanic cultures, there's this concept of what's called shamanic illness. And shamanic illness is when people have these so-called psychotic breaks in our mental health system, where in fact their gift as a shaman is just expressing itself, and they are brought literally to the center of the village and they are held in that space until they can come through this and emerge out the other side. And when they emerge out the other side of this with whatever things need to happen around that, they are acknowledged as a shaman. So, the question is, like, there's this old saying that the difference between a mystic and somebody who's psychotic is it depends on who you talk to, tell their experiences to. And so all I can offer from my perspective is, it depends on who you're surrounded by. So if you do your own work of researching these and discovering all of these experts and people who have identified that this is a real thing and what might be actually happening here, and you can educate the people around you that know you and love you, that can hold you through this, I think it can be a very different experience.
Thank you. And yeah, what I'm doing now is starting in my very small village, and because people saw me and they were afraid. And they told me later, if you do that again, I'm going to have to distance myself from you. So what I'm going to be offering in my small little village is workshops on how not to be afraid of people that are having these experiences. So that's a start. And I really appreciate the work that you two are doing in the community and in the world to help change the perspective on this. Thank you very much.
I wanted to add just one thing, because we've talked about Stan Grof extensively. He was probably the most prolific researcher on LSD to understand especially states of psychosis and transformative, realities. He believed, and he was legally doing this until, it was shut down, sat and documented over 1,000 sessions of people under LSD, because he felt like this was probably one of the most potent way to fully appreciate and understand rather than pathologize. So I'm not here to state, medically that I have competence in this field, but I'm, like Bonnie, recommending more openness and less judgment. I think Eric was next.
Yeah, thank you. Well, this is very interesting. I don't know if I have anything to offer or not, but I had some experiences early in my life which changed my life, and later discovered holotropic breathwork, which I found to be absolutely amazing. And then I also did rebirthing for a while, which is like holotropic breathwork without the music. And I think it's a very powerful tool. But the thought that comes to mind is that we have come to accept our way of thinking so much that we think of these other states as non-ordinary, But I don't think that's entirely accurate. It's as if, we humans now live in houses. Most of us, I see the backgrounds behind most of the people in this call, and looks like we're inside some sort of a house or a building or something. And we take that as ordinary, as normal to be in our houses. We don't live outside anymore. But that's kind of a parallel with this non-ordinary state of awareness that maybe we should spend more time outside. And in fact, it has been shown that being in nature is very good for you. But I think also, of the words of Ramana Maharshi, who said, there is no new state to achieve. Get rid of your present thoughts. That is all. And I think, if you spend some time with that, I think it's right on, actually, that we get very caught up in our thoughts. And after all of these experiences with breath work and other means, absolutely at first, the experiences were extremely intense, and they got less and less intense. And I wonder if that isn't because being in my head so much, the experience of being in my body was very powerful. And now I think that the work is to incarnate more than anything, to fully incarnate rather than to seek some experience.
Beautiful.
And I don't know if I've made any sense. Anyway, thank you for letting me speak.
Wonderful.
And I really enjoyed this. It's been very, very interesting. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
So thank you so much, guys, for this workshop. I've had some very interesting experiences, but probably nothing like this particular one, because it was such a physical experience where I was out in nature in the Adirondacks and just, doing a little trail with my husband, and then saw this beautiful pine tree. And I do dowsing and earth energy healing, so I do connect with trees. And my process is to just kind of rub my hands and put my hands out a few inches from the bark and ask for permission to connect and, just get a sense that I've got the approval. So I stood there for a few minutes, and oftentimes I just get a nice kind of connection and it feels good, and I give gratitude to the tree and walk away. Other times I've received quite profound messages, but this time I'm standing there and suddenly I was like smacked in the head by the tree, and I fell backwards. I didn't fall. My husband actually reached out to grab me. He grabbed my arm. So I actually had a witness, but it was just like I was energetically hit. It was right at the third eye, and I had this impression of an eye right here. And I have to say that was a mystical experience. It was quite astonishing, and I haven't had anything like it since, and this is 2015. And over the time at the time it happened, I thought, okay, well, that was certainly wake up. And personally, I thought, okay, well, I thought I was kind of awake and connecting and with spirit and doing what I was supposed to do. And for the longest time, I've just been kind of mystified by it.
More of holding that mystery. These experiences propel us into a different way of holding things, a different way of wondering about things. I mean, look where it's propelled you in your career. You offer a podcast where you talk to people about their mystical experiences in nature. So how beautiful. You can't make that stuff up, right? Wonderful. Thank you.
And back to this idea that we can't make sense of it, to what shared earlier, this to me, knowing about the suspension of the default mode network, there is really no better way to hold these moments, these sacred moments, but to suspend any kind of rationalization. So while our brain, if you will, is programmed to seek meaning, that craving seems to be in the way of inviting those experiences
And just having the experience. Yeah.
and having it itself. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Zach, thanks for your patience.
Thanks. Yeah, so my whole persona at this point is invested in my mystical experience and the calling that has resulted from it. And basically, when I was 19 years old, I ran into Joseph Campbell somehow, the Power of Myth series. And that's basically almost instantaneously upon watching The Power of Myth, the Kundalini serpent in me activated. And it took about 6 months for my ego to resign its commission. And then I was in a state which was considered somewhat dangerous. Like, I was considered mentally ill by the people around me. But to try to make a long story short, I was given a psychedelic cookie, or my friend, he made one cookie for himself and one for me, and he didn't tell me he was making it. So it's one of those things where I didn't even know I was taking it. I think it was potent marijuana, but that was enough given the condition I was in. And my world dissolved, and then basically a circle appeared, and I curl up into the fetal position, like I'm being reborn, basically. That's what it felt like. And I passed through the circle, and then I'm bathed in a white light. And then the white light kind of dimmed down, and now I'm sort of back in reality. But I'm in reality the same way that most people are back in reality. And this condition that I was in now continued for 21 years until the year 2018. And people who are interested in shamanism, you could call it like a shamanic initiation period. That might be a good reference. That's why shamanism is interesting, because we literally don't have a word for that in our culture. We don't have a word for a mystical state in which you're partly mentally ill, but somehow also being initiated. I don't even know what the word for that is. But I came back in 2018, and I feel like at that point, it's like, okay, like Return of the Jedi, right? Okay, I'm back on Earth. Now I'll to make this long story short, it took me 7 years. But now I started a podcast because I didn't know what to call myself. So I came up with a new term, which is pretty clever. I call myself a depth mystic. Ta-da! And my podcast is called the Depth Mystic Community Podcast, because I didn't see a community, and I want to feel like I'm in a community, even though I'm doing it completely by myself. So I called it the Depth Mystic Community Podcast. I have 10 episodes so far, and I've been doing them weekly. So 10 weeks ago, that's when I finally have what I now call my ministry. So like the mystic vision gives you a calling. I realized ministry is a pretty good word for what I now have. So I'm 10 weeks into that, and I have no marketing strategy, but I signed up for the email list for this, and I'm like, if I don't attend this meeting, like, what am I doing? Because it's literally like both Jungian depth psychology oriented and mystical experience oriented. So I had to like stop by. That's my rationale.
Welcome home, Zach.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Sadly, I think we've come to almost the end, but I do know that we have one question or request. Bonnie, have you noticed it? From
I
Paul.
definitely would just make a quick mention here. Paul's asking, can you please speak more about archetypal intelligence? Well, we could go into the depths of that. I could probably talk to you all day about that, and as I'm sure you could too. But I would just say, from a probably the brief perspective is that Archetypes, Jung considered archetypes to be the building blocks of the psyche. They're the way that the psyche is structured. Therefore, they're essentially the way that our cosmos is structured. It's the way that we live our lives. We can understand things because archetypes are patterns that we can immediately recognize without having to go through a whole long definition or description of them. And so archetypes bring intelligence in a quick form, like a lightning bolt, a blast of intuition or understanding that can just strike you immediately. And so when we have these kinds of mystical experiences, I believe these experiences themselves are archetypal. Like we have talked about the shamanic initiation. This is an archetypal experience that somebody can have. And those of you who have shared your experiences, you are in that archetype when you have that experience. Now you're carrying that archetype because you've had that experience. Being a depth mystic, Zach, is such a beautiful way to put words to that kind of experience or that kind of archetype that you're having. So, in short, they are technically the soul's intelligence. And whatever plan or blueprint you put together for yourself as consciousness to come into this world and to have the experiences that you are having, you are now feeding yourself in these kind of blasts of information by the archetypes that you are actually encountering in your life at each turn, or that are at work in your life overall in a given experience. So that's just kind of a short way to look at it. I'm sure we could probably do an entire webinar on this. Maybe we will next year. I'm definitely going to miss these. I just want to say to everybody, thank you so much for those of you who have attended live or who are listening to this later. This really, for us, is a community. When I had my mystical experience, I didn't have a mentor. I didn't have anybody to talk about this. I didn't know where to go with it or what to do with it. But the community began to evolve around me as I started on my quest, because we have to have community in order to be able to do this work. We cannot do it in a vacuum. Jung said that, and most of the mystics would guarantee that as well. Yes, you can go off into a cave and have the experiences, but in order to integrate them, you need to have that mirroring back to you and that holding and being around people that understand something about what is going on for you. So I hope that speaks to everybody, and that, as you go on your own path, that you can truly, really continue to seek out people in your life that can understand you, that will support you, that will hold you, and that you can do the same for others. Truly, this is also the deep, deep work of our soul.
Well said. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Really lovely
All right.
being with you.